People buy one tool, call the account safety problem solved, and get flagged anyway. They grab a proxy and assume that's the whole job. They grab an Antidetect browser and assume the same thing. Every so often, someone spends real money on a handful of cloud phones, expecting those alone to carry an entire fleet. All three tools are genuinely useful and all three solve a real narrow piece of the account separation problem, but none of them covers the other two. This is what each one actually isolates, where they overlap, and where they don't touch each other at all. The misconceptions, the phrase people search for, is usually some version of what's the best tool for multi-accounting, as if the answer were a single product. That framing is the whole mistake. Account detection runs on at least three separate layers: the network you connect from, the device and browser fingerprint you present, and the behavior you show over time. And a proxy, an Antidetect browser, and a cloud phone each answer exactly one of those layers. Buying the best possible version of just one still leaves the other two completely open, which is why just get a good proxy and just get a good Antidetect browser are both incomplete advice on their own. What a proxy actually isolates? A proxy isolates one thing and one thing only: the network layer. It changes the IP address your connection appears to come from, which affects geography, the internet provider that address is registered to, and whatever reputation that specific address or range has built up over time. That's the entire job. A proxy does nothing whatsoever to change your canvas fingerprint, your install fonts, your browser's automation flags, or how you move a mouse across a page. Run 5 browser profiles that are otherwise identical through 5 different proxies, and the device fingerprint underneath is still the exact same fingerprint on all 5, network layer aside. It pins proxy types and what they signal. Not all proxies read the same way to a platform on the other end. A data center IP is cheap and fast, but it's registered to a hosting company, and hosting companies don't have residents, so that address type carries an inherently higher risk score, by default almost everywhere. A residential proxy routes through a real home internet connection and carries the trust of an ordinary ISP subscriber, which is exactly what most platforms expect from a normal user. A mobile proxy routes through an actual cellular carrier, and carrier-grade net means thousands of real phones can share the same visible address at once, which is both a strength, since that address type reads as inherently trustworthy, and a reason mobile ranges get watched carefully in their own way. But an Antidetect browser actually isolates. An Antidetect browser isolates the device and browser fingerprint layer, completely separate from the network. Each profile gets its own consistent canvas rendering, its own reported fonts, its own WebGL output, its own navigator properties, its own screen and hardware values, so that 10 profiles running side by side look like 10 different physical machines rather than one machine wearing 10 disguises. What it does not do on its own is touch the network layer at all. An Antidetect browser, with no proxy assigned to a profile, still connects out through whatever network is actually underneath it, which defeats a large part of the point if every profile shares one office connection. How Antidetect profiles work under the hood. Each profile in an Antidetect browser keeps its own isolated cookie jar and local storage, so nothing persists across profiles the way it would in normal tabs of the same browser. Layered on top of that isolation is a set of spoofed fingerprint parameters, values fed to the sites you visit, instead of the real hardware values underneath, consistent within a profile session over session, but different from profile to profile. It's a genuinely different tool from a proxy, solving a genuinely different layer, and the two are meant to be paired together. One proxy assigned per profile, rather than treated as substitutes for each other. Spoofing a fingerprint isn't a one-time fix either, because detection scripts keep getting better at spotting a spoof, a canvas value that's too perfectly randomized, changing on every single load instead of staying stable like a real device would, is itself a tell. A set of navigator properties that are internally inconsistent, claiming a phone's screen size while reporting a desktop's processor count, gives away the seam between the real machine and the disguise. A decent Antidetect browser has to get all of these details to agree with each other convincingly, not just change each one in isolation, and the tools that only change the obvious values while leaving the subtle ones untouched are exactly the ones that stop working first. What a cloud phone actually isolates. A cloud phone isolates something neither of the other two can touch at all, because it isn't emulating a device, it is one. A real phone running a real mobile operating system sitting on a real carrier connection accessed remotely. App-based platforms increasingly fingerprint far deeper than a browser ever could, reading hardware sensor data, install histories, SIM details, and system-level signals no Antidetect browser spoof reaches. A cloud phone answers that by being the genuine article rather than an imitation of one, which is why it's the tool of choice specifically for platforms that live inside a mobile app rather than a browser tab. Quant's cloud phone trade-offs. That authenticity comes at a real cost. A cloud phone is a physical device sitting in a rack somewhere, being maintained, charged, kept updated, and paid for per unit, which means you cannot spin up 100 of them the way you can spin up 100 browser profiles or 100 proxy ports in an afternoon. Scaling a cloud phone fleet means scaling real hardware, and that puts a practical ceiling on how far this specific tool goes before cost and management overheads start to bite. Picking the wrong tool for the platform. It helps to see how this goes wrong in practice. Someone running an app-only mobile platform buys a stack of clean residential proxies and calls it done, not realizing the app itself is reading sensor data and system signals a proxy can't touch, and the accounts get flagged on the fingerprint layer regardless of how clean the network looks. Someone else buys an excellent Antidetect browser for that same mobile app and finds it barely helps either, because a desktop browser spoof doesn't reach the deeper app-level signals a real phone's operating system produces. In both cases, the tool wasn't bad. It was aimed at a layer the platform wasn't even checking. The stacking logic, the actual answer to which one should I use, is almost always some combination of the three rather than a single pick. A proxy handles the network layer underneath everything. An Antidetect browser handles device and browser fingerprinting for anything that lives in a web browser or a desktop client. A cloud phone steps in specifically for mobile app-only platforms whose fingerprinting reaches deeper than any browser spoof can convincingly answer. These tools are not competitors fighting for the same job, they are specialists stacked on top of each other, each covering the layer the others were never built to touch, the layer none of them solve. Here's the part a lot of people skip past. None of these free tools, no matter how good, touches the behavioral layer at all. How fast you add after logging in, how evenly you space out connections, whether 10 profiles all move in the exact same rhythm at the exact same hour, none of that is a proxy setting or a fingerprint parameter. The best proxy and the best Antidetect browser on earth still sit on top of an account that behaves like a script if it's operated like one, and that layer only gets solved by how the account is actually used day to day, not by anything you can buy. Picking based on the platform. The practical decision starts with where the platform actually lives. A web-first surface, something used mainly through a desktop browser, is well served by an Antidetect browser paired with a matched proxy, and that combination alone covers the two layers that surface can actually see. A mobile app-only surface with deep SDK-level fingerprinting calls for a cloud phone, because no browser-based spoof reaches the signals that kind of app collects. Lower stakes, high-volume testing work, where the fingerprint barely matters and only the network does, can sometimes get by on a proxy alone, at least until the stakes rise. Pfeiffer's cost and scale trade-off. Lined up against each other, a proxy is the cheapest per unit and the easiest to scale into the hundreds, since a new proxy port costs little more than the bandwidth it uses. An Antidetect browser sits in the middle, a moderate per seat cost that scales well into dozens of profiles without much friction, since the software overhead per profile is small even as the count grows. A cloud phone is the most expensive per unit by a wide margin and the hardest to scale past a modest number, both because the hardware itself costs real money and because someone has to keep it running, updated, and healthy. But it's also the most authentic answer available for the platforms that actually demand it. And for those specific platforms, no amount of savings on the other two tools makes up for picking the wrong one. None of these three is objectively better than the others in a vacuum. They simply trade cost and scale against how deep the isolation actually needs to go for the platform in front of you. Why the curve matters more than the number, the exact prices move around depending on the provider and the month. So the specific figures matter less than the shape of the curve itself. Proxy cost scales almost linearly with how many ports you add. Browser cost scales gently with how many profiles you run on top of the software. And cloud phone cost jumps up a full tier because you're now paying for a physical object that has to exist somewhere, be powered, and be maintained. That shape, cheap and linear, moderate and gentle, expensive and stepped, tracks the authenticity each tool provides almost exactly, and spending at the top of that curve on a platform that only ever checks the network layer is money spent solving a problem that platform was never going to ask about in the first place. The honest bottom line, there is no single tool that is the answer here, and any pitch that tells you one purchase solves account separation is selling you an incomplete picture on purpose. The real skill is matching the right combination of these three layers, network, fingerprint, and physical device, to the specific platform and its specific detection depth, and then layering ordinary patient behavior on top of all of it, since none of these tools buys that part for you. I run and test all three of these myself. Real mobile proxies, real Antidetect browser profiles, real cloud phones with actual handsets behind them. Because running a fleet across different platforms means needing all three layers covered properly, rather than betting everything on whichever one is easiest to buy. Multi-account ops. Com has the full written comparison, tested proxy and cloud phone picks, and honest reviews of the Antidetect tools that actually hold up. No affiliate guesswork, just what I run on real accounts every day. If you're deciding what to actually buy, that's where to start. Subscribe for more honest, tested multi-account ops. Next time, how platforms actually link your accounts across all these layers at once. The signals behind the detection this whole stack exists to answer.